implementing MDO and experiences of the US Army and hurdles faced with them towards implementation of the concept. Delighted to, we do look forward to hearing you, and thank you very much for having been patient in this, what do you say, time zones and timelines which are very, very difficult. Thank you very much. Over to you, Colonel Roper.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this forum. It's my compliments to the speakers. Every single one of them has had something to contribute to this incredibly challenging issue. And as many of them have identified, talking about them is great, but ultimately the test is what's the collective action that's taken upon this afterward, a sustained action. A number of people, before we even move beyond it, is to, again, MDO and the things that occur in it, things that are not necessarily new. You know, at the beginning of Iraqi freedom, we were attempting to synchronize elements and effects across 5 domains, all the US services, other countries' services, and lethal and non-lethal effects. But we didn't do it in a rapid and continuous manner. It was done episodically, and as several speakers have referred to, it's really tied to the air tasking order cycle, which gets you out at 72 or 96 hours, and it's a little tough to turn inside that loop if you're trying to integrate all the effects that we're discussing here. Next slide, please. So this is our agenda. Pretty much is just the questions that I was asked to develop, and then I'll close it out with some lessons learned to date that we think we've discovered. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yep. Underlying the U.S. Army thinking about multi-domain operations is all the capabilities we're getting and all the updated, what will eventually become doctrine, really aren't going to get the job done unless U.S. and partner political authorities authorize sufficient force posture and readiness levels so we can effectively compete. So having it, but not having it in a place where it can be politically relevant and it doesn't get called up until after some kind of hostilities begin or after there's been a fait accompli by one of the aggressive powers that are, you know, our competitors, then it renders most of those capabilities irrelevant. So presence during competition, to not just be there physically, but to build relationships, which gets to the culture and the familiarity with all the other partners or potential partners that you may have in defending a particular environment. And I was very pleased to hear the comments of the Chief of the Army this morning when he stressed that you need to be as proficient in competition as in conflict. And I think that's a realization that we've come to, that obviously armies have to focus on conflict. That ultimately, that's the purpose that you have. A nation has an army, but you really can't have success in that phase if you haven't set the conditions for it during the competition phase. So I think that's where it gets hard. Next slide, please. From the U.S. Army's perspective, no service can conduct multi-domain operations alone, even as the whole joint force is challenged to conduct anything that resembles multi-domain operations, because it's so dependent, in particular in the competition phase, on understanding, having situational awareness of everything that affects you. And there's a lot of things that have been discussed today that are way beyond the military domain, because ultimately the war is going to be decided by a population and the population's leaders on both sides. And a lot of the information on what they're thinking, what's their attitude, is not going to be picked up by a satellite. It's going to be picked up by human beings interacting with them on the ground. And they're not necessarily just military people that are picking that information up. Key point on readiness, again, it's not just that you're trained and you know how to shoot and you're qualified on all your weapon systems, and not just on interoperability, which is incredibly challenging by itself, But again, having the access, permissions, and authorities that are critical to operate in the poorly defined competitive space. We don't, again, several speakers have talked about this. Sometimes Western militaries or Western countries, societies, have looked at it as a very binary phenomena. We're either at peace or something really bad happens, and then we flip the switch and we go to war. And that's not the way our adversaries see it. Right now, quite frankly, Russia and China are waging warlike activities against anybody that they think is holding them down. And that's getting into cyber, it's getting into intellectual theft, it's getting into influence operations and information operations, amongst other things, that they're not constrained by the same laws, norms, and values as democracies are. And so we have to recognize that, and then recognize our own rules and laws that keep parts of our military accountable, in some sense, can slow us down. Doesn't mean we should get rid of them, because they exist for an important purpose. But we need to understand what they are so we can overcome the fact that it takes time to mobilize a military, which again gets you back to the point of you require calibrated force posture and strong alliances and or partnerships. So if you need to operate together, you're not just meeting each other for the first time when something bad has happened or maybe is about to happen. And just want to stress something from the U.S. Army strategy, the overarching document that kind of describes how the Army is looking at the world. Every time I've heard the Chief of Staff of the Army, the present one or the previous one, who happens to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs right now, the Army is always going to fight in a joint and combined fashion. It's not going to war alone, and therefore it's got to spend more energy on that than it does right now. And again, just because it's not an alliance, partnerships or potential partnerships are just as important where common interests are shared by the two countries. Go to the next slide, please. Now, what are the challenges in joint and combined integration? And we've talked about some of these. Interoperability, and it's the interoperability of the systems, whether it's communication systems, computer systems, systems that enable the ground component to request for fires from the air component. And what the U.S. is coming to grips, U.S. military is coming to grips with, is it's trying to raise multi-domain operations into joint all-domain operations. Is as important as we know data was and is, it's becoming increasingly important, because if you don't get the connectivity where what a satellite picks up can be sent to command and control headquarters and can be processed by an intelligence AI-enabled system and then moved to the appropriate shooter with the appropriate ammunition and the appropriate authorities. If everybody has to, if it's air gapped and people have to turn and do the swivel chair, taking it off of one screen and then entering into a new system, then that really inhibits the rapid and continuous convergence that MDO is trying to stress us to get to. The doctrine procedures right now, this concept, multi-domain operations, is a U.S. Army concept that is not even a joint U.S. military joint concept. And as the Army's been developing it, it's been seeking input from its joint partners, its interagency partners, and friends and allies and partners that are interested in understanding it and then being part of it, or trying to understand how we can all be part of it together. And it's not, again, any prediction we have about the future, the only thing we know for a fact is we're wrong. So the next situation that we're envisioning in our minds is probably not going to occur that way. Maybe some similarities to what we think about, but there'll be some things that are different. And we don't need everybody showing up all using a different playbook. Again, there's got to be the mind and the collective mindset has got to be familiar to all the potential partners. Another challenge with interoperability is levels of modernization. So as the U.S. Army is undergoing right now its biggest modernization effort in about 40 years. And as it's getting, doing the research and development to develop new equipment, it's not all going to come online at the same time. And when a new piece of kit is fielded, it doesn't automatically get spread out to the entire force. As a function of budget, it's a function of the logistics, it's a function of training. So there's uneven levels of capability and proficiency, and we'll see that even more significantly as new long-range precision fire systems come on board, where not all units are going to be the same. And the key is to understand the capabilities and the limitations of everything that we've got, and don't just assume that one size fits all, because it gets a little more, it's obviously, we know it's a lot more complex than that. And another key point that was discussed a little bit by several other speakers, it's the command and control of other capabilities. So again, we're talking all the domains, whether it's 5 or 6 or 7, the underlying premise is there's got to be coherence and cohesion across all those domains, from the situational awareness to understand what's happening to the ability to leverage something from any one of those domains to achieve the intended effect at the right time, to provide the penetration and then the disintegration of the enemy capabilities and achieve overmatch. And we all know people are a little bit reluctant to turn over complete control of what they own or what they're responsible for to somebody else, unless you've trained with them, you've worked with them, you trust them, and there are limits on what they can do. So that is, again, that's sort of it's a cultural issue, and it's a culture of trust. And I'm not even talking about between different countries or different allies and partners. It's between the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Space Force, and who's doing what for whom and who's calling the shots. And if it's too centralized, then we don't have multi-domain operations. We've got slow, deliberate, synchronized operations. So how do you do that at the speed that it needs to happen, in seconds rather than minutes or hours? No, that's a work in progress. Nobody's yet got the answer to that completely. And the other thing on integration is it cannot be done, or should not be done, after the fact, where if the U.S. Army writes something and then says, okay, we're done, this is how it works, and if you want to plug in, you plug into this. We'd rather have the input while it's under development, so everybody sees themselves and everybody understands if we have to work together, or if there's a situation that requires it. We don't want to have like two systems that we just have to build a bridge in between. We already want to know roughly where they come together, which capabilities complement each other, because every country's got something that they bring to the game. Situational awareness of their neighborhood first and foremost, as well as military and non-military capabilities. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide, please? Political challenges. As I stated earlier, we, to varying degrees, are under attack from activities that are below the threshold of violent open conflict for the most part. I mean, obviously you've got some things happening on your border that, temporarily make that statement not 100% accurate. But since it's what's in the gray zone, and again, it's called that for a reason, it's difficult for political leaders to make the decisions and authorities to say, okay, military, rev it up and get ready to go, because people naturally would rather not be at war than at war. And the public leaders could be reluctant to do that. And most of our discussion has been on military related activities and the different domains and how they interact. But you take the economic domain and you take, one belt, one road, and we saw the slide on the string of pearls, and that doesn't pose any immediate military threat. It's the combined, I think the Chinese are waging multi-domain operations across more domains than we even know exist. And as they get access and secure access to key infrastructure, again, not an immediate physical threat, but it really strikes me, again, that's the game of Go. And by the time we all fully realize how they've positioned themselves, they'll have more tools in their toolbox than we might know right now. So I just think I know everybody's keeping their eye on it, but it's an interesting and somewhat threatening dynamic over the long term, nothing immediate. Another political challenge, implementing MDO. And I saw this in Iraq, and I really saw this in Afghanistan. Large coalition. And again, it's great to have a large coalition because people have common interests. And we shared that more in Afghanistan than Iraq because, we were attacked and went to Afghanistan because of 9/11. So as we were part of an alliance that brought, that everybody contributed to it, as well as other countries. But every nation has national caveats, as they should. I mean, every military, every army works for its nation first and foremost. So even when they're partnering or allied with or cooperating with somebody else, at its core, you have to comply with the norms, the rules, the laws established in your country or anybody's from their own respective country. And it is really challenging when you've got 26 or 49, and the number varied all the time, different countries participating. And you can't just tell Unit A, Organization A, to do the same thing you told Organization B to do without understanding what's the limit of the law that their national leaders will let them do it otherwise before letting them say they can't do it anymore. And another one is potential reluctance to host allies and partners or to provide support. Again, that's a political decision that is, the military kind of says, well, this just makes sense to do it. But militaries work for their political masters, and it's got to make political sense. So again, may not be able to change that, but it is important to understand that. I would also say, back on that top bullet, that to use, again, something that your chief said today, he said, we need to outmaneuver adversaries in the competitive space. Right now, our adversaries are outmaneuvering us in the competitive space, and we've got some ground to make up, and that's difficult for militaries to do. Next slide, please. Some background on the U.S. Army's development of MDO. The discussions really started around 2015, 2016, after the realization of what the Russians did in Crimea and in Ukraine. And again, some of the vignettes that have been already explained here quite well. And it was a wake-up call to the U.S. military that, okay, we've been spending 15 years almost completely focused on fighting the current fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, and focusing on, fighting with low tech, but very tenacious, lethal fighters that, again, and it's an insurgency, and like we know, those take a long time, and they're very messy, And very seldom is there a victory parade. It kind of fades away like that. But the U.S. military took their eye off the ball and China and Russia took advantage of a couple decades of lack of attention from the West, for the lack of a better term. And they developed, as several of you have said, the niche capacities, the anti-access area denial capabilities, that they don't need to have the same number of aircraft carriers as the U.S. has. They just need to find a way to make it really difficult for an aircraft carrier to do its job. And they've built up some capabilities there. They've also done some things with space and some other areas that we've talked about that it's, again, all that triggered the multi-domain battle discussion, which the concept initially was multi-domain battle, which was almost predominantly focused on fighting. And then as that went through the gates and the vetting and people talking about it and starting to figure out how do we do this, the realization slowly came that we needed to broaden it from the multi-domain battle to multi-domain operations. So including competition. So that in general, the phases, is competition, a crisis, conflict, and then return to competition. And that's where we want to stay. And we want deterrence to work. And we think most countries want deterrence to work. And we want to make that very simple decision for them to make by knowing that we're capable enough with our allies, friends, and partners to make it the cost unacceptable for them to cross the line. Now, an issue with developing the concept is it's an Army concept. And it talks about all the other services, all the other capabilities, all the other domains, and says, here's how it all ought to work. Well, the U.S. Army can't task the U.S. Navy to do things unless it's part of a combat operation, and that the Joint Commander says that. So we've been collaboratively, each of the services is working on a concept. And right now, the development, the big thing this community is working toward is the Joint All-Domain Operations concept, which we've discussed a little bit today. And the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, which is a supporting concept for the all-domain operations. And quite frankly, it's the most important one because it's how do you pull together the different capabilities and services from the services into a coherent joint capability, a joint warfighting capability, or even a joint competitive capability, instead of everybody playing it their own way. And we're not there yet, because since this concept was bottom up from the services, each developing their own concept, now at the joint level, they're trying to adjudicate what they're taking from each one of those concepts. And not everybody's going to be happy with the outcome. And that, again, we don't get paid to be happy. It's providing the input, and then some tough decisions are going to have to be made as to the different roles and missions of the services. And a lot of our roles and missions for the services were determined in 1947 after the conclusion of World War II. And there was a big relook at how do we do it better next time if we ever have to. And now we've got an emergence of a space force, and we've all reckoning with the changing characteristic, the changing character of war due to many of the technological advances that have been discussed today, and also just the different dynamics, urbanization, things that are beyond the military, but they affect how war is going to be conducted. And that will be the next step. And then it's the integration with allies and partners, informing, the big one we've been working with obviously is NATO, and sharing the thoughts that we've got. But again, it's not a one-way conversation. It's an iterative discussion, because if we're counting on, in many scenarios, having a coalition or a combined operation, then everybody who's invited to the party has a say in how it should work. And again, not everybody's going to be happy, but they all should understand it and be able to get their input on that. Next slide, please. In some lessons, and again, there are many more than this, but allies and partners are critical to MDO in competition and in conflict. And again, I take to heart the comment before that it was initially too much focus on conflict, and we're still trying to build up the capabilities that we haven't updated or upgraded in 40 years on some key systems. And then, but again, the competition space that's where you make deterrence successful. So that one needs constant attention. The need for cross-domain situational awareness, everybody has talked about that in some way or other today, and that's hard. And again, that's technical, that's procedural, and that's cultural. Allies and partners need to be engaged throughout the process to transform MDO from concept to doctrine. Again, a concept is something you can't do, and doctrine is ultimately what you can do. And so again, deliberately, there are some challenges even reading about MDO and thinking about it, because the capabilities don't exist yet to do all of it. And it's important to have that tension, and parts of it will ultimately become doctrine, parts of it won't. They'll fall by the wayside, like parts of network-centric warfare and effects-based operations. And I'll tell you one of the main drivers that the Army's using as an experimental aspect to kind of drive the change here, and it's really what MDO all comes together, is the Multi-Domain Task Force, which right now there's one that's dedicated to Indo-PACOM as the priority theater in the U.S. military's construct. And the core of the Multi-Domain Task Force, it's got long-range fires in it, long-range artillery, and there's an organization in it called the I2Qs, which is Intel, Information, Cyber, Electronic Warfare, and Space, all working under one battalion commander. So different companies with these different skill sets, instead of having to coordinate across the higher echelon Army staffs to get that capability, that's really the brains and the planning and the synchronization of taking input from all of those. So whether cyber is a separate domain from electromagnetic spectrum or space, there's no question that all those capabilities have to come together. And as an experimental unit, it's not a permanent structure yet, but the lessons being learned there are going to apply to the next multi-domain task force. It's going to be assigned to Indo-PACOM, and then the third, which will be assigned to Europe, working for the senior joint force commander. So either the theater commander, the theater combatant commander from a U.S. perspective, or the joint force commander who's in charge of it. He or she brings that all together, and everything flows from there. So that would be something, if you have not dug into that would be something to keep your eye on, because it's not right yet, but it's got all the pieces in there that you want to have on the team. Now it's just figuring out what are the best tactics, techniques, and procedures so that can support the real-time, rapid, and continuous synchronization. And the last couple points I'd say is another important thing that has to happen in competition is building mutual trust, whether it's exercises like our countries have going on together right now, or whether it's something else with the Quad or something at RIMPAC in Hawaii. These don't require formal relationships. They require understanding each other better, training together when we can, professional military education exchanges and partnerships and liaisons and visits, so people can, again, sit across the table from each other and discuss these things before they have to, if they ever have to go out and put them into practice. And that's not just between nations. That has to happen internal to the U.S. military, the Army and the Air Force and the Space Force and the Navy and the Marine Corps. they don't just, they shouldn't just show up when it's time to go. They have to build the trust in advance. And then the last thing I'd close with is a quote from our current chairman of the Joint Chiefs when he was the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, as he spearheaded the initial U.S. Army efforts to bring multi-domain operations onto the table so people could start wrestling with it. And I think the most important thing, and it came out pretty loud and clear to me today, was we must establish a common understanding about the collective problems we face. And allies and partners is internal, interagency partners, joint, members of alliances, and members of partnerships, and friends, and people potentially we're going to collaborate with. But it's the common understanding of the challenges about those problems. If you get that right, you're going to get everything. You have a much better chance of getting everything else right after that. Next slide. Thank you.